How many of you have heard the common phrase, "It's not what you said, it's how you said it"? No matter where you heard this term and what situation got you into that, verbal and nonverbal codes can actually make or break the chances of hearing this comment. Hi, my name is Kylie Volkov, and I am currently taking a communications course. Throughout this communications course, a subject that mostly has intrigued me is the relationship between verbal and nonverbal communication. I have learned a lot about this subject through the Introduction to Communication textbook by Lynn H. Turner. This textbook, along with many more credible sources, have helped me gain knowledge on the relationship between verbal and nonverbal communication. The relationship between these two can be shown through many different factors, such as repetition, emphasis, reinforcement, contradiction, and substitution. Repetition and emphasis are both factors which allow verbal and nonverbal communication to interact with each other. Repetition is shown differently between verbal and nonverbal communication. Verbally, speaking about the amount of times that you have done something is repetition. A verbal example used in Chapter 4 of the textbook is just simply stating, "I've tried that 3 times." This is verbal communication because you're just simply stating it. On the other hand, pointing up 3 fingers and saying, "I've tried that 3 times," also incorporates nonverbal communication. This is an example used in the textbook as well. Repetition through nonverbal communication is shown only in actions, not in speech. Verbal and nonverbal communication interact with each other also between emphasis. Stating something in general, no matter what topic, is verbal communication. Specifically in the textbook, the author uses the example of saying, "I'm annoyed." Also, in an article written by Adam Kendon about gesture studies, the author writes, "We point at things to show what we are referring to, and when we describe objects or actions, we may use gestures to enrich, clarify, or elaborate our descriptions. Gestures are always nonverbal, but also vital to elaborate and emphasize the verbal statements in which we are saying. Using a specific tone of voice is when nonverbal communication comes into play through emphasis." As stated in her communication textbook, author Lynn H. Turner says, "When you smile, wave your arms, stammer, or whisper, you're contributing to the meaning a listener interprets, even though none of those behaviors are actually words. The emphasis of these actions are what turns verbal communication into nonverbal communication." Additionally, in the abstract of his article on verbal and nonverbal communication, author Fatik Mendel claims, "Several gestures illustrate the relationship between verbal and nonverbal behavior. Gestures are what make up nonverbal communication and connect it to verbal communication. Both of these can connect through the emphasis of each gesture. Reinforcement and contradiction are both factors as well, which allow verbal and nonverbal communication to interact. Verbally, reinforcement is tougher to analyze without the additional nonverbal communication. Reinforcement is mostly shown through nonverbal gestures. An example would be saying, "Glad to see you." Now, this statement in general is just verbal, but the way you say it makes it nonverbal. If you were to say, "Glad to see you," and smile, then the nonverbal gesture of that insinuates reinforcement. To give another example, in an article over gestures, author Adam Kendon wrote, "In our everyday dealings with one another, we tend to make distinctions in how we attend to one another's actions, treating each other's themes of action and interaction in a highly different way. The reinforcement of communication used is important when viewing and interpreting others' actions, which also can apply to contradiction. Contradiction, just as reinforcement, is displayed through nonverbals. Glad to see you, as the same example, if you were to say that with rolling your eyes and looking away, then that would show contradiction through the nonverbals. I mean, it doesn't even seem like you actually are glad to see them. Substitution, as well, heavily focuses more on nonverbal communication than verbal communication. Sometimes nonverbal gestures are not even needed, which is when substitution comes into play. Substitution works as a sub for verbal gestures. Verbal codes are not always necessary, and nonverbal codes usually are. Nonverbal codes focus more on behavior, so it is easier to substitute nonverbals for verbals when communicating with another person. An example used in the textbook would be waving hello. Sometimes waving hello is enough, and you don't even need the verbal hello to say that. As for my own example, you may say I'm tired, but just laying your head down on a pillow with your eyes shut is enough to explain that you're tired. The nonverbals in that situation is enough. Though substitution also replaces verbal codes typically, verbal codes are still implied. When you wave hello, most likely someone is processing the word hello in their head. You don't even need to say it because someone already knows you're saying hello. In Adam Kinden's gesture article, he explains the theory that gesture function only as aids to the speaker as he seeks to arrive at a verbal expression. This is a different point of view on substitution. This is an example on that different point of view as gestures and disagrees that gestures or nonverbal codes can be substituted for verbal codes. It's nice to see that other point of view because though substitution heavily connects verbal and nonverbal communication, it also shows that that may not always be true. Sometimes verbal communication is needed. In conclusion, whether we realize it or not, verbal and nonverbal communication is the true way that humans interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. Specifically, the relationship between the two is most important. Repetition, emphasis, reinforcement, contradiction, and substitution are all factors that connect the relationship between verbal and nonverbal communication. Now, the next time you hear, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Think about the relationship between verbal and nonverbal communication. Hopefully in the future, we can all avoid this comment by taking control of and remembering the relationship between verbal and nonverbal communication.